Welcome, welcome, friends. Welcome back to Hurricane Hub Live. We're one day closer to the weekend. Happy Thursday to you. Today's June the 18th. We've got some cool things to talk about here on the show tonight. We've got what's left of Arthur. That was our first tropical storm of the season. Spent not even 12 hours as a named storm, but it is on the list and it is notched off now, and it is still bringing impacts. Even though it's well inland and no longer considered a named tropical storm, it's still bringing some significant impacts. Now, elsewhere in both the Atlantic and the Pacific, things are rather quiet, but we'll see where things may go as we approach the end of June and, of course, head into July, where we can look for some activity. Just want to let you know, if you're looking for more shows like this, Hurricane Hub Live is every weekday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, right here on the 13 News Now streaming app or on our Tegna partners all across our hurricane markets across the company, along the Gulf Coast and along the eastern seaboard. All right, let's get to it tonight. We've got some things to talk about. Arthur came and went, as I mentioned, 12 hours, not even really, was a tropical storm, named tropical storm. And when it was at its peak, which was 45-mile-per-hour winds is where its maximum gust got to, it was heavily sheared and did not present very well on satellite imagery, as all of its storminess was pretty much offshore and sitting over the Gulf. Of course, that did move inland since and has brought some significant impacts and damage to property and injuries as well. The rest of the Atlantic, though, as we typically find at this point in the season, we're 2.5 weeks in, right, is quiet. And there's nothing out there brewing, although, however, I will take that back, because there is one area of interest which actually still has to do with Arthur. There is an indication, although a low chance, that it may try to redevelop after it hits the ocean again off the East Coast. The Gulf Stream's there, replenishing very warm waters from the south. And it's possible that once it's back over its fuel source, it'll try to reactivate and reorganize. We'll see. It's a very low chance. I'll show you the map on that in just a second. But nothing else expected to form in the Pacific either, which is unusual because it's been a very active start there. There's already been 3 named storms in the Pacific Basin, or Eastern Pacific. So Arthur, gone. Tropical storm, maximum winds 45 miles per hour. Next would be up Bertha. That in and of itself seems like an ominous name, right? Bertha, it hasn't been retired, so it's still there. So we'll see what we get when we get it. Typically, our second named storm isn't until July. So we'll see. We'll see. All right, here's satellite imagery of what's left of Arthur. Now that it's moved over inland, the last Hurricane Center update on this, the last advisory issued was last night. Now the reins have been taken over by the Weather Prediction Center. They're in charge of issuing the flood alerts, the rainfall outlooks, and that kind of thing, and kind of issue their own advisories for tropical systems after they move inland. Now, it's a very obvious spin in the atmosphere here. It's a very rather large system encompassing, 3 states, Mississippi, Alabama, and now spreading over into Georgia. Now, I want to show you this watch polygon here. This is a tornado watch, and this is very important to remember. With landfalling tropical systems, on the east side, or really right to the center, you're going to find the dirty side. That's what we refer to it. It's nothing really, nothing written down in terminology, but that's what we refer to it as, the dirty side. And this is the frictional component of land adding spin in the overall spin of the system. So you're more likely on the eastern side, right side of the system, in the dirty side, to experience the tornado threat. And there have been several tornado warnings. There's an active tornado watch there. There was a second one earlier. But as this moves off to the east and northeast, if, say, this center was to pass to your northwest, that would place you in the dirty side of things. If it passes by to your south and east and you're located northwest of it, not likely to experience any tornadic threat here. But that's been a problem here right along the Alabama and Georgia state line. And as it lifts into the Carolinas, we'll see tonight if there's enough spin left over in the atmosphere that we could have some sort of a tornadic threat develop, especially as you get closer to the coast and some of those bands move over the open waters, say the Currituck Sound, offshore the Outer Banks, maybe some waterspout potential there. All right, I mentioned that it may try to redevelop, right? So here's where the Hurricane Center's still issuing outlooks on it, technically. The center of it put over Alabama and Mississippi. Now, as it moves east-northeast, hits the waters off the Atlantic coast, which, I mean, they're marginally warm. We've got the Gulf Stream coming up off the southeast coastline, spreading some warm water there. So, I mean, there's a small chance that this would try to get going again, 10% risk of it going. But again, it's going to be moving away from land if it does, so not really a worry at all. Still a big rain producer. and that's typically what these tropical systems do. They rain themselves out. Portions of the deep south have picked up well over a foot of rain, and there's been some radar estimates that have been extraordinary, up approaching 2 feet of rain in some locations as you get into portions of Louisiana and over into southern Mississippi as well. Additionally, this is right up through the end of the weekend. Could see several more inches of rain here. So the Weather Prediction Center, again, issues their flood outlooks. And this is a little different from when we look at severe weather outlooks. It goes from level 1 to level 5. With flood outlooks, it goes from level 1 to level 4. Level 4. So there's a possibility of flash flooding, likely flash flooding, very likely an extremely high chance of flash flooding. And today they did upgrade portions of southern Alabama, the far western tip of the panhandle of Florida, southern Mississippi, and portions of Louisiana, with that very rare level 4 threat for flash flooding, just of the inundation there, of the amount of rain that has been picked up over the last 48 hours. So even though it was a weak tropical storm, it doesn't matter. The impacts surpass whatever storm name it gets. So never get hung up on, oh, it's just a tropical storm or it's just a Category 1 hurricane. That's based on the winds. It's nothing to do with the amount of tropical moisture that it may bring with it as it makes landfall. All right, checking on the sea surface temperature anomalies out there. Refresher that what we're looking at here, anything in orange or yellow, is going to be sea surface temperatures that are above the seasonal norm for this time of the year. A lot of warm waters as you get into the subtropics. Main development region beginning to heat up. Of course, the Caribbean's always pretty warm, and as well as the Gulf. But look as we go into the Eastern Pacific. Wow, almost bathwater here. Do you remember several hurricane seasons in a row that we had this type of anomaly in most of the Atlantic Basin that led to very active seasons? And that's what's expected in the Eastern Pacific. A normal to above normal season in the Eastern Pacific in regard to storm count. A lot of that's being driven by a likely strong El Nino that you can see very, very evident here. Equatorial Pacific waters off the coast of South America that are warming and warming at a rapid pace. That could have very big implications on our hurricane season, bringing activity down as it increases wind shear across the entire basin. Let's also get a check on the Saharan dust. This time of the year, it's quite prevalent, and that's exactly what we see. Now, keep in mind, these dust particles do a very good job of reflecting back sunlight and blocking it from reaching the ocean surface, so that could lead to some cooling of the waters there. So sea surface temperature anomalies were warm, but they weren't extraordinarily above normal. We've got dust present out there right now, and as we project into the future, more waves. In fact, the density a little bit bigger here on some of these dust plumes that come off and eject off the coast of Africa. One here as we approach the end of the month. That's just about to head out over the main development region. Now, as we get into July, and late July particularly, we start to see these plumes eject farther north off the coast of Africa, so no longer really influencing tropical development there. That's when we start to see the main development region open up for business. And as early as early July, the western half of the MDR really starts to light up. Atlantic tropical activity, of course, this time of year we're not seeing much. June is typically quiet. July sees a little more activity. And then by August, yeah, we're off to the races usually. Mid-August, August 15th or so marks the start of a period of about 6 weeks or so, right on through early October. That brings in some higher activity. September 10th is the climatological peak of the season. So when we looked for tropical storm origin in June, like we just saw Arthur form, the Gulf of Mexico open for business. Pretty much the entire season you could find the possibility of development in the Gulf. Same with the Western Caribbean. These typically actually, a way to look at this is these parts of the basin open up first. They never really close down. They're always pretty active. And the Southwest Atlantic over the Bahamas. Now, as we go to July, we add an additional part to the opening of the basin. I just mentioned it earlier, but we add this to the Gulf that's still open in July, stays open all season long. Western Caribbean as well. Southwest Atlantic is going to stay very active as well. Close home development here off the southeast coastline, gets a little bit larger there. And then the far western MDR starts to open up in July. And then later in July and August, we see it a little bit farther off. And we see the long track major hurricane development likelihood going up as they move into that very warm waters there. All right, coming up next after the break, we've got a very interesting interview in-house today. We're going to talk about coastal resilience and mitigation coming up in just a little bit. Welcome back to Hurricane Hub Live. We're back in our streaming studio. We're very lucky today to have a live interview in person here. Jess Whitehead joins us. And I want to get this right, Jess. You're the executive director of Old Dominion University's Institute for Coastal Adaptation and Resilience. ICAR for short. We like our acronyms here.
We do love our acronyms.
And welcome to the show.
Meteorologists love some acronyms.
We do. Science in general, right? Loves the acronyms. So, Jess, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Tell me a little bit about what the Institute at ODU does. And for our viewers, ODU, Old Dominion, is located right here in Norfolk, Virginia.
Thank you for that. So the Institute for Coastal Adaptation and Resilience is really unique in that we focus on the practice of building coastal resilience. So we partner with communities, with localities, organizations, businesses to engage, understand their needs, and then develop and deploy real solutions based on integrative, innovative, and applied research. So we really see ourselves in the university as a catalyst in the Hampton Roads region and for all of coastal Virginia to make sure that we have thriving communities no matter what Mother Nature throws at us.
Now, it seems like it's great placement for ICAR here in Hampton Roads. As we talked about before the show, it's one of the most susceptible coastal regions along the eastern seaboard. And explain to viewers why that is.
Absolutely. We are right at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. And so we have historically for hundreds of years, and even going back to when the many tribes in Virginia were here, it has always been an important location. Right at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, extremely strategic. Today, we have the world's largest naval base. We have the Port of Virginia. We have 7 different cities in our region. We have 17 localities overall in the Hampton Roads Planning District region, and some of the most historic sites in the United States. We also have one of the highest rates of sea level rise in the United States and the highest rate on the East Coast. So that means that as we go forward into the future, floods that we may have seen in the past have the potential to be higher as the baseline sea level is increasing, as well as the vertical land motion from our land sinking on top of that. So we've got that 1-2 punch going on.
Really a double whammy with the subsidence out there. So I brought this up when we talked before the show. Is that a big contributing factor to the sinking of the land across Hampton Roads is that Chesapeake Bay meteor impact?
Yeah, we've got the meteor impact. We've also got water extraction going on for our industries here. So those two, again, kind of lead to that compaction. Right now, it's probably about 1/3 of our relative sea level rise. As we look forward into the future, you would begin to expect to see that global rate, kind of the relative rate that you see from things like ice melting that's currently locked up on land or changes in ocean circulation becoming a larger component than the subsidence.
Now, I just want to clarify, because that meteor impact, you didn't miss it. That was 35 million years ago, so it was a long, long time ago.
Good.
But let's get into the flooding aspect of things here, Jess. How do institutions get into drawing the flood maps? You know, they're very intricate here in Hampton Roads, and it can be different from your neighbor just down the street from what your flood zone is. So what kind of goes into that? What do folks look at to draw those?
Yeah, so the Federal Emergency Management Agency is the entity that is really going through and approving these maps. And really what they're looking at is what we call H&H, hydrology and hydraulics. So the hydrology is what's the water. For us, a lot of that is the probabilities of certain storm surges, the addition of wave action that might do damage on top of that storm surge, and then the hydraulics of how that water moves through the landscape. So it's a really complicated engineering exercise. Interestingly, we now have private companies that are doing this more and more often and starting to get some different results by really taking modeling approaches to this and trying to get a handle on some factors that are harder for these engineering studies to capture, like really big rainfalls and what happens when you have one of those lower probability but high consequence kind of rainfalls interacting with things like our stormwater infrastructure. So that's really a cool science question of why do we still do science on this? The FEMA flood maps don't couple to the stormwater infrastructure, and we know that the cities have modified so that they are relieving flooding in some areas, and then things happen like leaves back up a storm drain and you might have flooding in a new area. So there's a whole lot of research going into how to do flood modeling better, but right now the real kind of jurisdictional process that holds sway with your mortgage company, which is what everybody at home cares about, is that FEMA process.
All right, very interesting. So, Jess, what are some proven tactics for mitigation of storm impacts from either a hurricane, a nor'easter here in Hampton Roads, or like what are some ways, some interesting ways that cities and municipalities are adapting to the rising sea level change and overall more impacts from storms?
So that is a really broad question, Tim. I think most people understand the concept of a seawall or a bulkhead. That's kind of traditionally, if we go back in history, how we handled that stuff. Let's stick up a big wall. Sometimes there are challenges in that, and sometimes that's the only thing you can do. If you are in a river channel and you have really big ships that go back and forth, a wall is your option. But sometimes if you're a homeowner, you may be living in an area where you want to put up a bulkhead on your property. When you get wave action in these storms, it'll start to scour in front of that and begin to erode the integrity of that wall and start to see that failure. So a lot of what we focus on in ICAR, and in particularly in our partnerships with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, is how do we use nature to work with us and help out in some of these circumstances. Sometimes, and in Virginia, it's actually, if you go into code, it's the preference. You have to prove, you use a living shoreline or prove that you can't use one. And those are more natural techniques that use vegetation, that use different kinds of materials that allow oysters to build up in certain areas. Those are things that aren't going to stop a 15-foot storm surge, but they definitely help with things like dampening down wave action. And in some cases, in places like North Carolina, where they've had recent big storms like Hurricane Florence in 2018, they've been able to find out that these living shorelines end up having less damage after a storm. But it's really dependent on where you live and the conditions of what you're trying to protect. So we work a lot with when can you use those natural and nature-based solutions primarily, and when do you have to use them in hybrid approaches so that your gray approaches, like you have to have a seawall, aren't doing as much damage to the natural environment and the habitat. And that's some of the coolest, most enjoyable work that we do, and it crosses all of the disciplines. We've got people who are, we have research faculty within ICAR who are working with ODU's Civil and Environmental Engineering Department to build a wave flume that will allow us to test different vegetation types and see how wave action gets dampened by different types of plants. But then we also have people in our biological sciences who are partnering with people in the School of Business. Right now, when you go and all of these cities are trying to put in more of these nature-based solutions, there's one nursery in New Jersey supplying the plants. So they're trying to figure out how do we work in Virginia to make this an attractive business proposition and something that will work so that we can be growing those in Virginia. So there's all kinds of different ways that we're working. And the coolest thing about ICAR is being able to be that hub where all of these faculty from different departments can be working with people from the cities and collaborating with them to get things on the ground and make sure it's, data to decision.
Now, artificial intelligence is becoming more and more embedded in what I do with meteorology and weather forecasting and model prediction. I'm interested to hear how that's coming into play with maybe modeling storm scenarios for mitigation purposes or adaptation for coastal communities. How are you guys using it?
Yeah, so right now we're really, I think, on the forefront of beginning to experiment with how AI can be a value add in these processes. You're absolutely right. A lot of it has been in the modeling arena, particularly in getting into flood modeling, developing better flood maps, doing those really difficult data intensive things like coupling that stormwater infrastructure or determining how we layer up these solutions. I think a lot of the future is also going to be in helping planners make better decisions. When you are working for a locality and you're making a decision about a project, it's not just the science that comes into it, it's the planning, it's the zoning, it's the economics and the benefit cost. It's really hard right now to synthesize all of those different data points really and modeling into something that's useful. And I think that that's somewhere where AI can be of a benefit and something that will help planners be able to process a lot more information than they can currently when they're having to make these decisions.
Now, real quick before I let you go,
Yeah.
what's the most overlooked preparedness in regard to hurricane preparedness measure that you think people just forget about?
Buy flood insurance. 100%.
Yeah.
Absolutely no. And right now, there are no storms in the Atlantic, assuming that we don't see Arthur 2.0 out of some very, very tiny chance. But there's a 30-day waiting period when you purchase federal flood insurance. So now is the best time to price a policy. Your homeowner's insurance does not include flood. You've got to buy it separately.
Now, do you think it's necessary even if you're not in a flood zone?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, when we look nationally, it runs somewhere between 26 and 30% of flood damage is happening outside of these mapped flood zones. And it's because of all of these other factors that are harder to layer on together. We especially saw that in a lot of places in Hurricane Helene, in Southwest Virginia, Western North Carolina, flooding outside of those mapped flood zones. So if you see water from your house, if it rains at your house, it can flood if you get enough of it. So buy that flood insurance. And if you're not inside X zone, or I'm sorry, if you're inside the X zone, that area that's outside of a mapped floodplain, you're going to get the best price. And in a lot of the Hampton Roads localities, they participate in the community rating system, which gets you anywhere with our localities between a 15 to a 25% discount on that rate.
Fascinating. All right, thank you so much, Jess Whitehead, Executive Director, ODU Institute for Coastal Adaptation and Resilience. Really appreciate having you on the show.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's been a pleasure.
All right, we'll be right back. Welcome back. Here's the answer to our trivia question from last night. What was the last A-named storm to be retired? We just passed the 25-year anniversary of Tropical Storm Allison in 2001, made landfall in Texas, caused a ton of flooding and damages there. All right, tomorrow night, 8 p.m., we'll see you right back here for Hurricane Hub Live.